Thank you, Madam Speaker. I consider it an honour to be able to speak for a third time on C7, as this is a bill which would dramatically expand access to assisted death in our country. And so I rise again to represent the thousands of voices across this country who feel that this bill puts them in crosshairs. I'm referring to vulnerable Canadians living with disabilities and disabling conditions who believe that they've been targeted. They've told us that this legislation singles them out by providing them with a special path to assisted death. They want us in this place to know that their lives matter. This is the last opportunity for now for members of this House to legislate in regards to C7 to ensure that their best interests are considered. I want to use my time today to reiterate what has been a common theme throughout my interventions on C7. The Liberals are moving to impose sweeping, consequential legislation despite what they've been told clearly by Parliament and by Canadians. Yes, they've even ignored their own legislation. The government should not have moved to implement this bill before the parliamentary review of C14 that was slated to take place before the end of June next year. They should have done that first. We do not yet have a clear enough picture of the impact a Canada-wide MAID regime has had on our country. 5 years is not remotely enough time to take stock of trends and of abuse and the impact of MAID on charter-protected conscience rights. I remember the words of the former member from Winnipeg Centre, Robert Falcon-Ouellette, during debate on C14. In his view, the Liberals should have delayed the implementation of Canada-wide MAID regime for at least 5 to 10 years, until it could be adequately determined what the impact of assisted death would be in all communities across our vast and diverse country. Mr. Ouellette spoke against adding fuel to the suicide crisis that has taken such a heartbreaking toll on our reserves. Tyler White, CEO of Siksika Health Services, said recently that C7 runs the risk of undoing the work that Indigenous elders have done to curb the frequency of suicides amongst Indigenous youth. Mr. Speaker, what message does Madam Speaker, what message does C7 send these young people? If Indigenous advocates believe that C14 was a step in the wrong direction, why are they taking things even further, this government, with C7? What is the purpose of rushing this? I also remember the elements of the C14 debate pertaining to instances of MAID abuse in other parts of the world. And this is key. The Belgian model, of which C14 was modeled after, is known for its abuse. In Belgium and the Netherlands, MAID's laws, once limited to mentally competent, terminally ill adults, now includes adults and children with mental deficiencies, severely disabled individuals, and even those with treatable psychiatric conditions such as anorexia and depression. Between 2012 and 2017, the Netherlands alone saw a 600% increase in euthanasia, which was sought to address psychiatric conditions. Speaker, when was the government planning to take a hard look at Canada's MAID regime and how we can plan to prevent this kind of abuse in the future? The Minister of Justice says it's in the works, it's part of the plan. Why was it not done first? This is the cart before the horse, it's the tail wagging the dog. By ignoring a 5-year review, this government has also cast aside the concerns of physicians. We can't ignore the monumental importance medical professionals place on their Hippocratic oath. Such is true of Dr. Ramona Colho, a champion of conscience rights in her field. She told former MP David Anderson at the end of Parliament, and I quote, "Doctors know the importance of conscience rights to protect themselves and their patients. People like me are being pressured to leave family medicine. I know palliative care doctors in Ontario who have stopped practicing. I know nurses in institutions who are feeling bullied, shift the focus, or retire early. The pressure is there, and we are looking for relief." End quote. It saddens me that this government has yet to establish conscience protections for medical practitioners who do not wish to violate their conscience while at a patient's bedside, as this bill is asking doctors to go far beyond what C14 even asked them to do. In Dr. Colho's words, quote, "It is my conscience that pushes me to go the extra mile, and I think patient care will suffer if doctors are not allowed to live with integrity and follow their conscience." End quote. Speaker, it is because of this risk of abuse on many fronts that many of us on this side of the House walked away from the C14 debate with an unpleasant feeling in our gut. one that suggested that the implementation of the MAID regime had started Canada down a very slippery slope to a culture of death on demand. We're at C7 today. However, there was an ever-present light at the end of that tunnel with C14. The 5-year review was important to members of this House and indeed to all Canadians. It is shameful that we find ourselves ramming through this legislation before this review is even started. On that note, I realize that the Liberals are frustrated that my colleagues and I have been so diligent in vocalizing the outpouring of concern from disabled Canadians, concerned medical professionals, and those whose personal beliefs conflict with this bill. That's our responsibility. The Liberals desperately want to speed up the passage of this life and death legislation. They want to meet the deadline imposed by the Quebec Superior Court. A deadline, I want to add, that they could have met comfortably if the House had sat in May and June and the Prime Minister hadn't prorogued Parliament in August. But, Speaker, in a way this is beside the point. The December 18th line is arbitrary, as was the deadline for C14. As legislators, our mandate is to pass the best legislation possible for all Canadians. I underscore the words all Canadians. Speaker, this bill has barely been studied as the Justice Committee only held 4 meetings of hearings. Many witnesses and briefs were denied a voice because of this, and of course, they certainly could have, should have, and still could appeal the Quebec Superior Court decision. We could have struck a balance in good faith of what Canadians actually want when it comes to end-of-life decisions. As I said in a previous debate, 4 years since the passage of C14 has allowed Canadians to further process the idea of assisted death. Almost 80% of Canadians believe that it should be easier to make end-of-life decisions for themselves. That number is 7 points higher than it was 4 years ago upon the passage of C14. At the same time, Canadians are unwavering in their support of strong safeguards for the most vulnerable in our society, as well as conscious protections for medical professionals. They are unwavering. According to an Angus Reid Institute poll released last month, the same majority of Canadians who desire empowerment in their end-of-life decisions want Parliament to weigh the risks of MAID for those living with mental health issues such as depression. Madam Speaker, 69% fear that depressed individuals could see MAID as a means to escape dealing with the underlying cause of their condition. 65% of those surveyed want Parliament and the courts to consider MAID's impact on the elderly and those with disabilities. They fear that death on demand could encourage these Canadians to seek it as a means of ending their perceived burden on others. This perceived feeling is being encouraged, and more research needs to be done. 62% want Parliament and the courts to examine the potential impact of MAID on our healthcare system. There is a danger that increased reliance on assisted death will lead policymakers to begin neglecting long-term and palliative care. And I'm being gracious in saying begin, Madam Speaker, because in my view, we can see this discouraging trend unfolding already. 70% of Canadians continue to live without access to palliative care, while this government has failed to invest the $3 billion they promised to help in closing that gap. Clearly, there is a discrepancy. Canadians are equally as outspoken when it comes to conscious protection for doctors or for those whose faith bars their participation in MAID. 57% agree that nursing homes and hospices with conscientious objections should be able to deny MAID to those who request it. The Canadian Medical Association indicated 23,000 doctors are available to provide this service. That is more than enough across Canada. We need to protect our conscious protections. Canadians want to see reasonable safeguards maintained in Bill C7. They want to see Parliament legislate with their interests in mind, their interests, not those of the courts. They want to see this House continue to give credence to the views of medical professionals and those with disabilities. Regrettably, judging by what we've seen through debate, C7 is another example of this government allowing the courts to legislate for Canadians. This bill is not reflective of what Canadians hold dear, care and compassion for all, regardless of age, disabilities or religious beliefs. Public health and economic safeguards have been the highest priority of this House throughout the pandemic. That's why so many in this place and across our country find that C7's attack on end-of-life safeguards so painfully ironic and troubling. It is for this reason that I cannot and will not support this bill.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just want to relay to the honourable member a bit of a story that I had. I shared recently on my Facebook page a picture of a clinic that said suicide prevention on the front door and a set of stairs going up to there, and assisted suicide on the side door and a ramp going up to there. And this is something that I've raised often about this particular bill, is that we've created two classes of citizens in this country. I recently had a constituent from Whitecourt reach out to me, Ms. Kay, and she's concerned that that picture that I shared on my Facebook page was not reflective of the current situation in Canada. I have assured her that it is indeed reflective of the case, and I'm just wondering if my honourable colleague can comment around the two classes of citizens that we're creating right here in Canada with this bill. Thank you.
Member for Yorkton Melville.
I thank my colleague for this question, and it definitely needs to be discussed. For some reason on the other side of the floor, they feel that they've heard from the disability community. I have no idea who they've spoken to, because across this country, every major disability organization has come out saying that this bill is a danger to them and they want to see the safeguards in there. So unfortunately, maybe there's a lot of Canadians that are just waking up to this reality, but I can tell you that every letter that I've received, as my colleague has, indicates that there is great concern, and we are people in this country who value life, who value every person. My children had the privilege of growing up in school where those with handicaps and disabilities were just part of the classroom, which was something very different than I experienced. And there's such a growing appreciation of the fact that all lives matter, regardless of your conditions, and we all have something to contribute to this country, to our families, and to our communities. Thank you.
And comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank my colleague from Yorkton Melville for an excellent speech. She did reference the issue of this steep, slippery slope upon which we find ourselves. And back when C-14 was being debated in this House, many of us had concerns that this was indeed a slippery slope, and we were generally mocked and we were accused of fear-mongering. And today, here we are. In fact, it was very clear it was a steep, slippery slope. And it's the vulnerable in Canada that are being exposed to medically assisted death. And I would ask the member to comment on the assurances the government has made that those with mental health issues, that children will not be exposed to this in the future, that other vulnerable Canadians will not be exposed and are fully protected under this legislation. Just her comments on whether she takes those words at face value or questions them.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you to my colleague for that question. I'm very, very troubled by what this government says and what it does. They put things up on websites, preambles, and yet don't include them in their bills. I'm sorry, I think I put something on my Facebook where I had said, if it's important and you say it is, it should be in there. If it's not, there is reason for concern. And we have heard that concern on this side of the floor as the official opposition from groups across this country. If they truly mean what they say, make sure those safeguards are in there. As a matter of fact, go the extra mile to say that you truly do care about the vulnerable and make it your priority, because right now there's no way that Canadians are hearing that from this government.
The honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And, you know, it was alluded to earlier, it was stated earlier in question period from a member that, you know, it's members of faith communities that are holding up this bill and that they have an agenda. But in my observations throughout the committees and hearing the witnesses, it has been primarily, you know, faith-based communities have been involved, but it's been primarily disabled communities and Indigenous communities that have been sounding the alarm on this legislation. And I was hoping the member could comment on how incredibly inappropriate it is to try to cast aspersions on the motivations of vulnerable people who are just trying to stand up for their right to live. Thank you.
Member for Yorkton Melville.
Yes, thank you to my colleague for that question as well. Very disconcerting when it drops to that level. I guess that shows desperation. That being said, the reality is that we all have faith. My faith may be very different than someone else's, but whatever we do in this place is motivated by who we are and what we have entrenched in our lives through the relationships and the exposure and the perspectives that we bring to this place. And I am honored to be here for who I am, and we are at the House of Commons. We represent the sense of Canada across this nation, all our different regions, all of our different perspectives, and it's an honor for me to stand here and to represent the people that came to us for help on this issue.